In this tutorial, we're going to talk about setting up a scene so that you can do product variations. A few years back, I worked on a very large project that involved producing thousands of renderings that were product variations. And that's what I want to show you how to do in Blender. At the time, we used Modo, which had a very specific feature for allowing you to set up variations. And then in one render, you could produce all of these renderings. And I wanted to figure out how to do that in Blender. So in this particular case, what we're going to do is take this and give it variations in terms of color. The products that I worked on didn't just change in terms of the color, but in some cases, there were very different material configurations. So we're going to end up looking at using scenes, staging with scenes. We're going to use actions, and we're going to use the nonlinear editor. And we're also going to look at the video sequencer. We need to make a couple of changes to Blender in order for this to work correctly. If you come up here in the outliner, we have the filter settings. I want you to make a change. By default, the little eye icon, hide in view, is enabled. But right next to it, there's a little screen that is disabled, and I want you to switch the two. Disable the eye icon and turn on the little viewport icon. That's a really critical change for this entire process to work correctly. I'm going to do a separate video kind of talking about what that does, but just go ahead and do that for right now. We're going to take a look at the scene. The scene is pretty much already set up in terms of just being able to render this one product. So the part of the product that is going to end up changing is the color part. Let's take a look at this as an example so that we can see a little bit closer what's going on. So we've got a lid, and the lid is composed of two components. So I've got the lid set up in a collection, and I've got two instances of that collection down in the main area. So all of these components are sitting in this collection called coffee mugs. And I've got a secondary collection here called variations, and this is where we're going to produce the parts that are going to vary, meaning whatever the material variations is that you need to do. The body, which is the component we're going to be changing out, has three materials on it. One is the basic material for the body, and there's a metal ring around the top, which I've seen in a lot of these products at the stores. And then the interior is a metal, but it's this blue one that's going to be the variation component. So the way that we're going to end up doing this is using sort of the animation system where from frame to frame to frame, we're going to swap out the material of this object. But as far as I know, Blender doesn't let you animate materials that are assigned to a slot. So what we need to end up doing is duplicates of this body mesh, and then assigning each of those duplicates to a different material, and then animating that. So let's go ahead and get started. Let's turn off the interactive rendering system. And we need to produce some variations of this. We want to produce instances of this geometry. We can duplicate this in one of two ways. We can duplicate it so it's unlinked to the original, or we can duplicate it so it is linked to the original. So if you make a change to one, you make change to all of them. And that's what we want to do. But before we make that change, we want to come down here and take note that this body.blue, there is a little icon right down here that is very important and critical to this workflow. By default, it is set to data. But we want it to be set to object. That's very critical. And what that allows you to do is assign materials to each individual instance of this geometry. If you don't do that, if it's in data mode, applying a material to one automatically applies to all of them. So now that we've turned that on and gotten that configured properly, we can come up here and start producing variations. So let's do this. So Option D, don't do Shift D, do Option D, duplicate linked, press the Escape key, and let's come back up to the original, and we're going to call this 1. I want to number these, body.blue. So the first one's going to be the original blue, and the duplicate is going to be number 2, body.red. So let's Option D to duplicate that again, and this one will be 3.body. Let's do this one green, and then the final one This one will be 4.body.yellow. Let's come in now and give each of these a proper material. So right now, let's go ahead and turn everything off. We've got the blue. So let's come down now and turn on the one that's going to become red. Down here in the material area, we need to give it a new material based off the blue. We'll call this red, and then we just need to give it a red color. Okay, so there we go. Let's do the same thing now for the next one, which is green. So we'll name this green, and then give it a green color. Okay, there we go. And then finally, the last one, which will be yellow, and a nice yellow color, something about like that. Okay, now in the project that I mentioned earlier, we had upwards of 22, 23 colors per product. We also had 5 to 6 camera views per product. So 20, 21, 22 materials times 5. And that was one of many products that we had to do. And we're going to simulate that here, but we're just going to use 4 product variations for our training purposes. So let's come back up and turn back on the main one. So let's go ahead and start animating this. So the principle is that for one frame, we have one on, and then it turns off, and the next frame, this comes on, and then turns off, and then so on and so forth, down as many variations as you have. We're going to switch over from the timeline, which would be just a composite of all the animation you happen to have for a selected object. We're going to switch over to the dope sheet, and we're going to create a new action so we can mix various actions together in the nonlinear editor. We will call this action one blue. Okay, so there's that. Now we need to turn all of these off. So let's go ahead and turn all of these off because their starting state is in an off state. You have to start the action with them being off. Otherwise, if you have them on, they're going to be turned on from the very beginning of the timeline to the point where you suddenly want them to turn on, and we don't want that to happen. Since we're working with body blue at the top, come up here, timeline is at 0, type I, and that will set a keyframe for the viewport, and then I again for the render, and that will turn it on for both the viewport and the render. The reason we switched over to the viewport icon here is because the little eye icon, you can't animate it. And it also only shows up in some places. Its state of being on and off is local. It's not global, and that will cause problems for us trying to animate here. So that's why we have the little viewport screen icon enabled. So the next thing that we do is come over to frame 1 and we enable it. Click it on and then press the I key, come over to render, click it on and then press the I key to establish a keyframe. And then in 3, we can just come back over because we're just going to turn it off now, press Shift and D and move those points over, which is in the off state. So we can see it off, on, off. So that's basically all we're doing in terms of a simple animation. Since we've got these animation points here and we're going to be repeating this, let's just go ahead and copy these keyframes. I'm going to type in action here so it's clear. We've completed this, so we need to push this data down to the nonlinear editor where it will become a little strip of animation data. So let's return our current time to 0. Let's come down to the next object. We can't just paste the data because we don't have anything that we've told to be in an animation state for this particular object. So come up here into Viewport, press I, and then under Render icon, press I, and then we can just come over and we can paste the data, and that saved us a few steps. So let's come over here and name this also. So we'll call this 2.red action. Okay. And then we push that down to the nonlinear editor also. Come down here to green, I'll go through this more quickly. Then we just paste, and we'll call this 3 dot green action, and then push that down. Come to the next and final one. I key, paste. We'll call this one 4 dot yellow action, and push that down. So let's jump over to the nonlinear editor now. I'm going to make room for it. Let's add horizontal pane here that we're going to convert into a nonlinear editor. Before we get going too much further, there's one more icon I want you to enable. Otherwise, this just won't work. Here in the nonlinear editor, there is a show hidden icon. Make sure that that is enabled. If you don't enable it, you won't be able to see all of these items that are turned off, and it will just cause havoc. So enable this. We see the entries for each of the 4 polygon meshes that we're playing with right here. Body 1, body 2, red, etc. And each one of them has a track. So if I collapse these, under body 1 blue, we've got a track right here, and then inside of that we have a strip, the action strip that we created, and we can pile up multiple action strips together if we wanted to. But what we're going to do is just stagger these. The current time marker is 0, but we don't have an object show up until frame 1. So we're going to start our animation at frame 1, and then when we jump here, we can see that blue one appear. Now, we've got overlapping objects. You can see Z fighting going on in the rendering. So we need to come down to the next one, and we need to stagger it by 1 frame. So when the first one here gets to the 3rd frame of that whole segment, it's now in an off position, and frame 2 of red is now on. So let's just stagger each of these like that. Now we come back up here, turn it on. There is blue. When we go to frame 2, we get red. And then frame 3, we will get green. And then finally, frame 4, we get yellow. So let's say that we want to make a change to one of the actions. So let's come back up here to blue. And if I want to edit it, we could come up here and select it. If you can see, we've got those actions there. But a quick way to do it is to select this strip and press the Tab key, and it takes us into edit mode. Let me show you. I'm going to press Tab key to leave. Let's come down to a later one, green as an example. Press the Tab key, and you're going to notice up here there's this darker green, and then we also have here. So it says there's no action for a given object, but here it's green, so there is an action, and that means we're editing it. But there is a little pin mark right here. If you click that, notice that this jumped back. And what that does is it shows you, let's come over here and select these. It shows you where the actual keyframes are in their actual encoded time, where we place them. But if we turn back on that little pin icon, it shows them where the current action is in the time. So just be aware that that's what that action does. So let me press Tab again. If I come back up here to blue, press Tab, and I need to actually select the object to see the action. So if we came in here and I expanded out that final keyframe, and then come in here and I can just click it, or I can hit Tab, then it transfers that data back. So let me click Tab here again, make that change, and then click it to move that data back down. Final thing we need to do for this is to come in and set the proper end frame. So let's take that to 5. We're now ready to move on to the next stage. Now let's say the client has requested another set of these renders that are identical to this, but they want to see the lid sitting down on the ground and resting up against the product. So the way that we would handle this would be by generating a second scene with all of this data and then make a change to that. So let's come up to the top here. We currently have one scene, which is basically an arrangement and setting of all of our objects. So we're going to come up here and we're going to call this 1 lid on top. Okay, then we come over and we click this little icon and we're going to do a full copy of the scene. So linked copy would produce a linked set of objects. So if you made a change in one scene, that change would be replicated in the other scene. And we need a little bit more control than that and flexibility. So we're going to go to full copy. And there we go. So you see the .001. And let's call this 2.lid on side. Now you can see that everything's been given a .001. So these are duplicates. They're independent objects, which gives us variability in being able to change the lighting, etc. But there's one thing that does not change, and that is the material sitting on the object. So for instance, if I select the ground, you'll note that the ground does not have the .001. Both scenes share materials. So that's one thing to keep in mind. So let's take a look at this. Let's go into render mode and we're going to see one sort of big difference. We see this reflection of the lights in the ground plane. I had set up light linking so that wasn't there. So let's adjust that. Let's come to the light, and when we come over to object properties under shading, we can see that I've got a light linking set up and the original ground is there, but since the name has changed, we need to drag that in and then turn that off. And let's do the same thing over here. So let's come over, drag that down and turn that off. And there we go. Let's come back to the frame 1 here, our blue. And let's now take the top lid. In fact, I just noticed that I've got the original lid collection on, and that should be off, the source collection. So down here, we've got lid side, we've got lid top. So this adjustment is only being made for this second scene. So all we have to do, turn that off and then turn the side on, which I had previously placed knowing that I was probably going to do this variation. And that is now set for all of these variations. So when we come in, these are all ready to render. So that's the beauty of this, kind of how we've gone and done this. Imagine if you had had 20 of these, all of these variations would now have the lid on the side. Let's go ahead and set up a third one where we've got a different camera angle. It's the camera angle that's now going to change. So let's come up here and we're going to duplicate this. In fact, I always like to go back to the original and duplicate that. In fact, let's turn off render, return our current time marker to frame 1, and we will click new, do a full copy. And now on this one, we're going to call this 3 camera up, or something descriptive to tell us what it is that we want to change. So let's come over to the camera. Let's come over here and let's pull this up so the camera view would be up. This is exactly the scenario that I had in my big project. We had cameras at various vantage points on the object. So in this particular case, it would also be nice if we had, in fact, I need to remember to turn off the lid source collection. Let's also go ahead and swap the lid position, and then we can check that. So, of course, I've got to come in now and do the same thing that we had done before. Let's find our lights. Come down here and pull ground 2 inside of here. And then this is pretty easy to do. Okay, now in this particular case, I think the material on the bottom needs to be changed to something that's more appropriate for this particular scene. But for the sake of simplicity of the tutorial, I'm not going to introduce a new material. But what I would like to do is make some adjustments to the lighting that are a little bit more tailored to this camera angle. So let's come up to our lights. We'll select this light here. Let's come into the top. And I've got them aiming at a target, so it's really easy to move them around. So you see I can come in like this, and I'm kind of looking right here to see how it gives some highlights to that. And then I think for this big light back here, I'd like to move it so I get a little bit more interior illumination. So yeah, I think that works pretty well. So that adjustment has only been made on that arrangement. So you see when I go back up to the original scene, they go back to where they were. And now in scene 3, they are customized for that scene. We're ready to tie all of this in together now. So the way that we do this is by creating a 4th scene. So we're going to come over. So we've got the 3 there. Click the new icon here. In this case, we're going to go to new. So we're just going to call this for rendering. And then we need to come in and create an environment for the video editor. It's the video editor that will give us access to being able to render each of the scenes at the same time. So if we come down here, collapse this, expand this out just a little bit, we want to add each of the scenes. So down here in the timeline, press Shift and A, scene, and there we have the 3 scenes that we've set up. So let's do 1. Let's zoom down over here. And it's only going to show you this really basic preview. So if we scroll over, we can see that there's one final frame here where it disappears. We just need to trim that off. Then press Shift and A again, add the next scene. We'll just need to trim its final frame off. Then come here, Shift A, and number 3, and trim its final frame. So there we have each of those scenes. For this 4th scene for rendering, we do need to configure the render environment that we want the render settings. So let's come to GPU. Let's come down. We only need 300 samples, thankfully. And everything there is turned on. I'm going to turn on GPU for denoising. That'll speed things up a little bit. Now we need to come down for color management and make sure it's the same. I am using Chronos, which is good for these product types of visualizations. Okay, now let's come back to the first one. Something that I've noticed is that if you press the N key down here in the timeline, it brings up our settings. You'll need to remember to make sure and tell it the camera 1 is the camera we want to render. For some reason on the first clip, it sometimes forgets that and it will render them blank. So we've gotten all of that set up and now we're ready to render. We do need to specify a source or a location rather. So let's come in. I've already set up a directory called mug renderings, and let's call this mugs underscore, and there we go. So this is the name that will be given plus a number for each of the frames. Everything is set up. We come over and do render animation and it will start. But the critical thing to understand here is that it's going to be blank for a while. It doesn't show you the progressive rendering as if you were in one of the other scenes. It won't show it till that frame is done. So if you come down, you can see there's a progress bar down here, but it won't show a progress until the first frame is done. Luckily, these are pretty quick, so they'll go by quickly. Okay, there's the first frame. And you can see it advance. And then there's the next one, and so on and so forth until it gets all the way done. And so the beauty of this is you could send this to a render farm, and they would just pull up scene 1 and render out as many 100 frames as you have all in one go. So in part 2, we're going to take a look at swapping out a different product so that we can continue to use all of this work in case you have related products that need to go through a similar pipeline and process to produce variations.